Thank you, Dr. Sadikan. Finally, we will have Farhan Tolakuli. He will be speaking on the limitation of international law in defending educational rights. He is a graduate of Columbia Law School and worked as an attorney at Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher. He is currently pursuing a PhD at UC Berkeley in business and public policy in conjunction with Haas Business School. Please welcome Farhan.
Hello, everyone. I was told when I got here that I would be speaking last, and the really nice thing about that, especially after very good speakers, is that you can simply say that all of the really good, important, meaningful things that I was going to say, they all said, which is clearly not the case. But what I hope to add to the discussion here is talking about is this good, the voice? Is that the deprivation of education in Iran within the legal framework that it exists. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about how international law can be used to combat these human rights abuses. And as a result, in talking about what international law can do, it's going to be a very short talk. There's very little international law can do as it stands currently. First of all, let me just say, what Iran is doing, and Peter Zujun mentioned this, June, by the way, it's Farsi for deer. They're clearly in violation of international law. That's unequivocal. Specifically, the 1975 treaties, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and some other rights, important rights. These two treaties, Iran ratified in 1975. And despite the fact that there was a regime change, they are still bound by those restrictions. So what they are doing now, and the educational deprivation, educational discrimination, is clearly in violation of that treaty. So violation of international law is definitely taking place here. The problem, though, is that there is no mechanism for credible enforcement. There is no overarching, credible court that can enforce these violations. There are currently international courts, international institutions. The problem is they carry very little weight. The sort of counterintuitive component of international law is that in order to be bound by international law, you are essentially have to be the perpetrator of the crime to decide that I'm going to be bound by this. In other words, we're relying on the perpetrators of these abuses to voluntarily agree that they're going to be bound by these restrictions. It's similar to saying that we're going to have burglars, we're going to rely on them to prevent burglaries, and them to prosecute themselves. It's not going to happen. But the way the law works is broader than simply formal enforcement to a court. The way the law works, even in domestic situations with individuals, right now I can choose to to throw this piece of paper on the floor here. And even if I have complete absolute immunity, that there's no way I'm going to be taken to court for this or punished for this, I may still choose not to do it. Why? Because you guys are all here watching me. And my reputation matters to me. As social creatures, we rely on the interaction and the support of other human beings to survive. Sina's here. If I want to eat later tonight, I'm going to rely on Sina to get me food. And so I will be, if my ability to eat is dependent on Sina, I might be even more careful about throwing that piece of paper. This is analogous to the way the system works in the global sphere. But instead of individuals, they're countries. These countries, even if they are not bound technically by some enforcement mechanism, by international law, may still be concerned about their reputation because they also depend economically, militarily, in all kinds of ways on other countries. They cannot exist in a vacuum. So we can potentially rely on states, and this is sort of referred to as vertical enforcement, for one state to punish another. It seems like we have a solution. The problem is, states are not in the business of advancing humanitarian causes. That's not their primary goal. In fact, typically when we see them advancing humanitarian causes, it's done under the guise of advancing a humanitarian cause when really it's a strategic or economic gain that they're after. So ostensibly, they're advancing something that's humanitarian, but really their only motivation in doing so is something much more self-interested. So we have a problem. We have We cannot consistently rely on states to enforce human rights violations. We don't have a credible international court system that can enforce these human rights violations. And that seems predictable, actually, because today we have sort of broad beliefs about sort of basic fundamental human rights that should exist for everyone, all global citizens, and yet we see human rights violations happening all over the place. This seems like a sobering thought, but I actually think it can be sort of empowering. So basically, we should also remember that the law is not, it's usually a lagging indicator of the social compass, of the moral compass that we have. The law was used to enforce slavery. The law was used in this country. The law was used to prevent women from voting. The law is not going to be there to advance social causes all the time. So what it takes is the action of individuals and the actions of transnational organizations, like the one that Ms. Ruzez is a part of, and to get involved to make these changes happen. That's the only way that it can happen. That's what's sort of both empowering and a little bit frustrating. There's no other way that it's going to happen. For us to rely on states to do this, we necessarily need for there to be an alignment between the humanitarian purpose and their strategic and economic objective. When that's the case, they might do something. But when that's not the case, and in a lot of situations it won't be, we can't rely on that to happen. Furthermore, the current international legal system is inept in many ways. Ideally, we'd have a court system in which there are credible judges that states have agreed will enforce certain very specific rights. And I think it would be best to begin with sort of universally agreed upon basic human rights. Right now, international law and the enforcement of international law is too broad. All international violations are sort of considered to belong in the same category. It'd be better if we had sort of a narrow range of basic human rights that everyone agrees to, because that would give these courts greater credibility. Moreover, the people who are in charge of these courts, the judges, it's believed it's a very politicized process. The fact-finding procedures are flawed in all kinds of ways. So the courts are not a very credible source. And based on the charters that initiated these courts, there is ambiguous authority even there, even in the documents. So there's a lot of reason to choose to evaluate the ambiguity in favor of saying that they actually don't have power over what I do as a state. I think it's also worth mentioning that in a more cynical view, it makes a lot of sense for states, for countries, to continue to have a system in which humanitarian causes are pursued by courts that lack real, true decision-making authority. Because that way they're not bound in their actions. And at the same time, they are at least satisfying the people who are aware of these causes that they're doing something. So it's in some ways in their interest to continue to persist in the system as it stands today, with a court that is inept and incapable of credibly enforcing international violations and gross human rights violations like the deprivation of education and more. I'm just going to close by saying, it really is up to just people. I mean, it really is. There's no other way that action can take place and that things will happen. We cannot rely on, a lot of things we can rely on the government, we can rely on political authorities to advance our causes, and sometimes they will, but when it comes to advancing humanitarian causes that are not ingrained in the law, it's up to us. So, right here on this campus in 1968, individual rights, civil rights were advanced by students. So today, especially in the information age, with the capabilities that we have today, we can do a lot. So I encourage a lot of smart people here to just open their minds and think about the possibilities. A lot of the revolutions that we're seeing in various countries in the Middle East and elsewhere have been prompted by the information age. Now the human rights violations are more transparent, so it's harder to hide these things. The government is no longer in control of information and media. And the ability to mobilize, the ability to, the potential for collective action is heightened in a way that never was before. Thank you.